Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And welcome to everybody here from the very end of the Floridian Peninsula. Well, we're not at the very end, but we're very close to it. And I want everyone to say hello to my friend, Mark Wunderlich. Mark, say hi.
Hello, glad to be here.
Nice to see you. And so this is part of a series that we have been doing for the last year now. This is episode number 47. We've been doing them almost every week since COVID started, and it's an opportunity for us to talk to artists, writers, curators, thinkers, and see what work they're doing and having a conversation. Of course, it's all been done by, it's all been brought about because of the pandemic. So Mark, where are we finding you this evening?
So I'm broadcasting live from Catskill, New York in the Hudson Valley. So just about 100 miles north of New York City.
Great. And you're at home, I take it, yeah?
I am. I'm here in my home, which is a 300-year-old stone house, not far from the Hudson River.
Yeah. And how have you survived COVID and the pandemic? How's it been for you?
Well, I guess I would have to say that, I'm feeling very fortunate in that no one close to me died. That I wasn't sick. That I lived in a place, out sort of off the beaten track a little bit in a kind of rural setting in my own house. Those are some really fortunate circumstances for kind of weathering something like this. I was able to isolate very easily, and my work was not. It was interrupted. Certainly, I teach, and I'm also a college administrator, and we had to do a lot of shuffling to figure out how to keep the wheels of a small college running during a time of great uncertainty, and so. The main thing I think that I did during the pandemic is I really threw myself into my work, both into my creative work and my profession.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I think under the right circumstances, certain people were probably able to even create their own residency at home and have the opportunity to do more work in isolation. But we'll get back to that in a minute. But just for those of you who are joining us, we're broadcasting from the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've been around for 47 years. We're one of the largest LGBTQ libraries in the world. Some people say in the solar system. I don't know who keeps track of those things, but in our library, we have 28,000 volumes of LGBTQ fiction, nonfiction, poetry, theater, biography, art. And they're all organized under the Library of Congress system. You can actually see what's in our collection by searching our card catalog through our website, which is stonewall-museum.org. And you can also sign up and you can get broadcasts, you can get newsletters about all the things that we're doing here as well. In addition to the library, we have an archive, and our archive has about 2,700 linear feet. That's how archives are measured. And if you imagine that, that's going all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. And that totals about 6 million pages of gay history. And so we do exhibitions based upon the objects and papers that are in our archive. Right now, we have one exhibition up, which is called Off Our Backs, and it's early lesbian publications from 1956 to 2000. And it's a great look at some of those publications because it really speaks to how women used publications very differently than gay men did at the time. And so it's about things about creating community, it's about politics, about addressing sexual oppression. And so that really comes through from some of these great serials that were around at that time. Tomorrow, we're going to be opening another show, which will be up through Pride and probably most of the summer. And it's called Don't Ask, Do Tell. It is the relationship between the United States government and the LGBTQ community. And again, it's coming out of our archives. and it traces the entire time period from 1778, when George Washington had a lieutenant who was an openly gay man and was arrested for sodomy, all the way up to Joe Biden, the current president, who removed the ban against transgender people serving in the military. And it's interesting to look at that entire history, because over those 225 years, there's really only a very slight sliver. It was during a very small period of the Obama administration, and then right now, in which LGBTQ people were not being discriminated in some way, but by the US military. So it's a great exhibition. There's a lot of stuff, obviously, in the 40s during World War II, and the blue discharges and those things. And then, of course, we tell a lot of the story about the don't ask, don't tell period as well, too. So that opens tomorrow, Friday, and then there will be a curated walkthrough with that will be up online next week. And then for those of you here in South Florida, you can certainly come by and see the exhibition. We also are having a big membership drive right now, and it's our goal to bring I think probably about 200 or 300 more members in the spring. And so we'd like you to join us as a member. If you're not, they start at $35. And I think we're about at 60% of our drive, which is great. So we'll be like NPR pretty soon and start, really cranking it out for people to say, now's the time for you to call and join us. And of course, you can do all that stuff through our website, stonewall-museum.org. This talk is going to be recorded, and then it's also being broadcast live now on Facebook. Hello to everybody on Facebook. We're happy to see you. Of course, you can tell all of your friends to watch it, and it will be posted on our website probably in a few days. You'll be able to see it, as well as all the other past shows that we've been doing as well. And I just want to say hello to my colleague, Ema, who's behind the scenes here, and just say hi to you, Ema, and just give us a wave if you can. And she'll pop up there in a minute. And Ema is going out. There's Ema. Hello there. Nice. Thank you. Thank you for your help. Happy to have you here. And so I think that's all the stuff. I usually forget something. Oh, as far as quick questions and quick comments go, feel free to pop them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to those as we go through the quick conversation. So that's the business I had to do, but let's talk about you, Mark, because this is about you. And this is about Mark's new book, God of Nothingness. This came out when?
It was just published this spring, kind of the first book of the spring from Grey Wolf Press. It was published in January.
Yeah, well, that's great. And of course, Grey Wolf Press is a great publisher for you to be with. So for those of you who don't know Mark, of course, you have access to his bio, but this is your fourth book, I think, right?
It is.
Yeah, which is great. Of course, you have your BA in German literature. You've done a fair amount of translating as well, too. You're from Minnesota originally, right?
Born in Minnesota, grew up across the river in Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, yep. And you've won a variety of awards, including one at the Fine Arts Work Center. You've won the Wallace Stegner Fellowship at Stanford, 2 fellowships at the Work Center, fellowships from the NEA, Mass Cultural Council, Amy Lowell Trust, and fellowships from Breadloaf and the McDowell Colony. Let me start there. Let me ask you about. Imagine I was 22, 23 years old, and I was a poet. How important are these awards and fellowships and residencies and these opportunities for someone who wants to spend a profession, 40, 50 years as a poet?
Well, I think what one is really trying to do as a young writer is both to kind of find community, to find a group of like-minded people, to find and to find situations where you can keep body and soul together, where you can kind of find support for your work and for your life. I think that a lot of the different kind of fellowships and things that I had, I was very fortunate in many ways that I had the support of those organizations. And as you know, organizations work really hard to kind of keep running, to keep providing these kind of opportunities. But they're a sort of sign, I feel like these, the literary infrastructure in the United States, the organizations that support the writing of, of literary fiction, nonfiction, poetry, experimental literature, that these are really trying to kind of guarantee a future for, for literature and the arts in America by supporting young writers. I think that these kinds of opportunities are essential. I think that they're a mark of our civilization, of us as a culture, as an American culture that values literature and values its writers. And so in that way, I think they are really important. But I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people who are outsiders, who are writing work outside of institutional support. And, that can be harder because it sometimes it can feel alienating to not have, the backing of an institution in some way, or to receive that acknowledgement. And it can be very challenging to keep going, and continue to write. So I am in favor of the expansion of those opportunities, making them more inclusive, more widely available, so that we really can continue to have, I think, a vibrant literary scene in the United States, and keep fostering new generations of writers.
Yeah, I think that's so well said, and it's actually so true. And I think particularly at this time where, I don't know what happened to particularly K through 12 education in this country during the pandemic. I mean, it's just been turned upside down. And of course, that's true for higher education. And just to point out the obvious here, you've taught in a variety of places, but since 2003, you've been a member of the literature faculty at Bennington, and also the first director of poetry at Bennington as well, which is devoted to providing residencies there as well. And so I want to talk about that in a minute. But I want to go back to one thing you were talking about with regard to the residencies. And I don't mean just residencies, but some of these writing programs. At times, I kind of feel that the acceptance in some of these programs has the potential, at least, of becoming a bit insular, that we do tend to look at other academics in the field and put them on juries, and having the same people making decisions. And sometimes I think I feel this more in fine arts schools, where it's like the same 500 people are sitting on juries and just changing seats on juries about making decisions about who's going to get into a school or who's going to get an award. Do you feel that at all? Do you feel an insular side on the writing side?
Well, I think what we've actually seen certainly in the last year, last 10 years, the last decade, is a real expansion of the American canon, of a kind of increase in access of, who is entitled to speak, of who has access to resources. There's been a huge shift that has really changed to kind of open the canon. And I think that American literature is starting to look a lot more like America now, which means, it's not just all white. It's not dominated by men, or at least it shouldn't be. There certainly are pockets where that is still the case. But what we are seeing is a moment of tremendous opening. And I think that's really important. There's often a kind of criticism, I think, that comes to that is sort of laid at the feet of writing programs, that they produce a particular kind of writer. But the thing is, there's so little public support for writers that writing programs are really one of the few places where young people can go and have some support. You can get a fellowship, you can have the tuition covered, you can have a teaching fellowship, and you can, spend a couple of years among peers really working and trying to perfect your craft, and really establishing yourself, reading a lot, making friends, and doing those sort of things. In early 20th century Vienna, people hung out in coffee houses. We don't have that same kind of culture, that doesn't exist here. And so for better or worse, we have, I think, the arts has kind of retreated to the academy, because it seems it can still find audiences there, people still value it there. That has advantages and disadvantages, certainly. It does mean, I think, that particularly at our public universities, a wider range of people can have access to writers, to experience, to work with, learn from writers directly. I think that that can be great. So I think it's a mixed bag, Hunter. I don't think that there's any kind of I mean, I direct a graduate writing program now, so I'm certainly part of that. But, I mean, there are hundreds of writing programs out there now, which I think are also turning people into readers, as in addition to being writers. And I don't really find anything wrong with that per se. I think that there can be a kind of insularity when it comes to what we think of as maybe the fellowship circuit of these sorts of things. But the truth is, people get called on to jury those sorts of things because they're good at it. And because they show up and they do the work and they are interested in maybe creating opportunities and in furthering their aesthetic in some way. I see my job as a teacher and as even as someone who administers a writing program. It's not that different. It's all part of one thing. The reason I'm doing that is because I am a writer. I'm making opportunities for other writers. I'm providing what I hope is a good education to people who want to read and understand poetry with greater depth and sensitivity and acuity. And I hope that when I move on to something else, that I will have made a mark in that way, and that I will sort of helped people to kind of realize their potential as writers and readers and thinkers.
No, I think again that's so well said, and of course it's really true in the sense that many of us have worked very hard to provide all these opportunities, to your point, yes, I think some of the criticism about an insular part of it. I mean, part of it is doing the work that it takes for juries and for faculty to show up and to do the work, and so I think that's a huge piece of it. And we are at an amazing point where we have the opportunity, even though many organizations have been very open in the past, but now there's sort of this groundswell of support around that openness. And I think that's very exciting as well, too. But now, so bringing this back to your own writing, I was looking here at the notes about the fact that you've been at Bennington since 2003, almost 20 years. And so now I know, right? It's crazy. Uh, Time moves on. uh, but the one thing I'd ask you is that, do you feel your voice or individual yourself as a writer, do you feel yourself as any different today than maybe 20 or 25 years ago with respect to your own gayness or your own queerness and how that came out in your work and what you might choose to do today, what you might not have chosen, or what you did choose 20 years ago versus what you
Mm.
choose today?
That's a great question, Hunter. And I think my very first book was very the the main subjects in it were very much oriented around gay life, about sort of leaving the Midwest, coming to New York City, eventually coming to Provincetown. But all of this was, it was a book that I was writing I wrote it in my 20s, and it was in the 90s. The book came out in 1999. That was the 90s. When I moved to New York City in 1991, it was the peak of AIDS deaths in New York City. That was the highest number of AIDS deaths that year. And I moved into the East Village, left Wisconsin and showed up moved into East 7th Street in East Village, where there were men in wheelchairs and where crack had just kind of come into the city and was wreaking havoc. The city was, in economic depression. It was a really rough time, and it was a very, a real awakening for me to find myself there in a community of, other young queers living in the East Village, while we were, also contending with our own mortality with this plague. with this disease that was striking people like me and like you, that was, killing us.
Mm.
And I think my first book really, dealt with that subject, wrote about life in, living in the East Village, and sort of living a really queer life. So I remember having an early teacher, a sort of older gay man who was he was certainly, he was out, but he was, I think we probably call him discreet. And I remember him warning me about, when I was started publishing these first poems, and he said, whatever you do, don't let yourself get labeled as a gay poet.
Mm.
And I remember thinking, well, it's a little late for that. I mean, I thought, like, I mean, what else am I supposed to do? I didn't quite, I thought that, and what I was hearing was one generation's admonition and a kind of warning to me. He wasn't trying to oppress me in some way. He was trying to, help me understand, his, in his world, the world that he had come into required that kind of discretion, and I was just unwilling to do that. And so all of my books, I think, have dealt rather overtly with the fact of my queerness, and sometimes more overtly, but as I age, I have to say, it's the focus has changed. I think that I don't really know how to kind of split off the kind of queer part of my identity from whatever else I am. I still write about sexual encounters. I still write about, desire. I still write about the male body. All of those things are still there because that's just, part of what I am and who I am. And so I think that it doesn't feel, oh, it doesn't feel as radical anymore. I don't feel like I need to kind of make a sort of self-declaration in some ways. And yet, I think in this most recent book, I ended up kind of pushing certain notions about identity, thinking a lot about what we mean when we say that.
Mm.
And, I mean, when we talk about our identity, do we mean just our own self conception? Do we mean, is it about how other people see us? Is it about what we do and say or make in the world? Is it about what we inherited? Is it about, like, our heritage, like who we are, what we come from? Those are, it's I feel like identity is flexible, it changes over time, and I think it's kind of all of those things. But I think we also have to understand that we can turn against certain parts of that we can bring out other parts. It's flexible, it's not fixed. And, I wanted to kind of think about that a little bit in this poem, particularly as I find myself, I found myself in this period of time writing these poems when a number of people in my life died.
Mm.
And, that's a kind of reckoning that happens. It was the day after my 50th birthday was my father's funeral.
Mm.
I mean, this was like one of those kind of moments where I thought, okay, I had other plans for my 50th birthday, Hunter, rather than burying my father. But that's what I did because, that's what the circumstances handed me. Um, but this book, I think, is one of a kind of reckoning with adulthood, with what it means to go on living when people around you are dying. And and I think writing poems about that kind of helped me to come to an understanding of what that meant.
I think, yeah, and it's so interesting because I think, you started that answer off with talking about what it was like in the 90s, and I'm about 15 years older than you, but what I found interesting when my parents passed away was that I was the only one of my siblings who was actually prepared to deal with intimate death because I had seen so much of that around me, and so it prepared me for those kind of things. And of course, it's a maturing process that we go through as adults, as we have to deal with those things. But I also want to say that I think the idea about the flexibility of identity is a really important thing. I think it's a very important thing for us to look at right now, because so much of the conversation in the public square, whether that's literally in the square or on college campuses or on social media, is about identity. And it's important for people to find their and for us to recognize people's identity. But I hope we don't get caught in this trap of saying, this is a white cisgender male forever, or this is that, and that we have the ability to evolve and change, and we can, and our identities can morph as we do through our life, and that I find to be very exciting.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, again, that it isn't a situation that's fixed, that people do change, that we, and more I want to think about like what I want to sort of leave in the world, where I want my attention to go, how I want to, where I want to spend my attention, my time, my money. I'm thinking about, there's a limited amount of time, right? We all have a limited amount of time. I'm becoming acutely aware of that. And so I'm also becoming very careful about what I do and how I spend the time that I have. I think that that's also is an interesting thing to think about too. I think I spent a lot of energy when I was younger in this in certainly in my poems, in these efforts toward a kind of self-declaration of queerness, because I needed to, I needed to do that. I needed to define that space in certain ways, and I needed to kind of solidify that identity in a way that was unapologetic, that kind of exercised the parts of my upbringing that I was still retaining, that I wanted to slough off. But I also have to say that, one of the things that happens for, I think, a lot of queer people who find themselves rejected by family or friends, or, that there's those things happen. Also, I think for a lot of us vis-a-vis the AIDS crisis, having made it through that, having kind of survived those worst days, that it's also, you find yourself on the other side of these things with a sense of liberation.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I was, in some ways, I was also set free, when kind of toxic members of your family reject you for various reasons, you're like, bye-bye. It's like they have also liberated you. Like you don't have to fixate on them anymore. They have allowed you to kind of become yourself independent of them. As painful as those moments can be, as wounding as those things can be, it also opens doors. And it's, in the moment, it probably doesn't feel like that, but I think in retrospect now, looking back at some of the things that happened when I was younger and where I am now, I do feel as though some of those things actually set me free. If you horrify your parents when you're young, you don't have to do it again when you're older. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, okay, I actually am, like, I can create my own. I am I am in charge of my own selfhood. No one else can really dictate that to me. I don't owe them that myself. I really only owe it to my own well-being, my own sense of myself. So, those are some of the things that I think I've learned now in my 50s, that
Well,
you know,
it's funny when you said in the beginning about your 50s and time is short and stuff, and not to sound morbid about it, but there was a point, this sort of very profound point that I had in my 50s, where when you're in your 20s and your 30s, you just feel like you're a master of the universe and you're going to live forever, and you don't think about that stuff. But there was this point, it was like a creeping feeling, like Pinocchio's the Isle of Misfit Boys, and you were turning into a donkey or something. But I remember having this feeling of like there was the jug of milk, the big plastic jug of milk was put on the table, and for the first time I knew there was an expiration thing printed in purple on the top of it. I couldn't read the number, but I knew there was an expiration there. And it is this awakening, this thing that happens to us as we age. And again, not to be morbid about it, it's just literally, you know, what the process is about going through life. And then you get to the point where you don't care what it says on the top of that milk bottle anymore. You just keep on going for it. So um,
Well, you know, in some ways too, Hunter, we're also we're really going to be one of the some of the first generations of out gay people, of out gay men who actually get to age. You
correct.
know, I mean, if we're thinking of a sort of post 1950s, you know, really thinking of gay liberation happening in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, that kind of, you know, that real the sort of change that began to happen at that point, and then they're, you know, creating out communities of queer people. Then the AIDS crisis came and wiped out a generation. You know, it was really, and so we just haven't had that. And so, in some ways, we're also trailblazing in this way, that there is now going to be a whole group of gay men who get to age, and who actually, as out people, as you know, people who get to claim that identity in very full ways. And that's kind of remarkable. I mean, we're seeing it happen now.
Let's
Um,
hope we still look fabulous. And
I know. It's, I hope we can keep our hair.
all right, let's talk a little bit more about the book. So when did you start putting this group of poems together?
So I worked on this book for about 5 years, but there were a couple of periods during which I worked much more intensely. And a lot of the book was written in 2018, kind of during this year when I was, you know, kind of contending with a number of deaths that happened, and a lot of the poems are kind of responding directly to that. I write about my father in this book quite a bit. He appears in a number of poems, and he was ill and in a nursing home for about a year. And I remember just understanding that he was dying, that this was the sort of process. It was happening slowly. He had brain cancer for a long time, and so I could see that I was losing not just my connection to him, but also to all of the kind of stories of his parents and his grandparents, you know, people who some of them you know, I knew my grandparents, I knew some of my great grandparents. But it was this connection to a past that I could see dwindling, and that, you know, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to ask him questions any, you know, soon, that day was coming when there would be no more answers from him. And I felt a kind of urgency to capture some of that, to think about that, to hear those things from him one last time. And I think some of that has certainly found its way into the book.
Yeah, and you definitely do see it in going through the book. So you say you finished it in 18, and so you finished it before the pandemic. When was it originally scheduled to come out?
Well, when it was finished, we were kind of scheduling. You know, when I was speaking with my editor at Grey Wolf, they said, well, you know, we could put it out in the fall of 2018, or it was, yes, and I said, you know, uh, or they were saying fall of 2020. We can put it out in the fall of 2020, but of course that would be the election, and there's absolutely no way, no way. So they delayed it until the spring, and you know, had that as the publication date. But of course, the whole year it was in production, we were, you know, the pandemic was kind of starting, and so, you know, I was planning a kind of a tour. I was going to be traveling, and all of that, you know, none of that came to pass. But instead, I have been very busy with a lot of, you know, with readings and events and podcasts, and this whole new, you know, a whole new range of ways of talking about books, that, you know, have reached, it's astonishing, have reached hundreds and hundreds of people, rather than, you know, reading to a room of 50. You know, I mean, a lot of times I've given these readings to, and there's 150 people there, and then it's like archived someplace and people can watch it afterwards. It's been really remarkable, and I miss the contact with people. But this is, it's, you know, I mean, this is the time we have, right? Like, this is the moment we're living in. There's no reason to kind of lament that, you know, like the world went into an economic crisis, you know, thousands and thousands of people died. There's like, you know, crises all around the world. My book tour is not chief among those, you know, those kind of complaints. It's all been just fine. I mean, really, it's been fine.
Well, that's great. That's great to hear. And of course, I think it's great because when I think about small organizations, whether it's the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown or whether it is Stonewall Library, or even to some degree, I mean, Bennington's is a bigger organization, but your budget was only so big to bring so many people in the course of a year. This gives a queer library like us the opportunity to have people from all over the country not only participate and offer their work, but then other people to be able to hear it and see it. And that's one of the few things, the few blessings I think that have come out of this whole pandemic thing. Because I mean, if you had asked me a year and a half ago, would you be doing virtual readings? I would say no, that would be terrible. Nobody would want to do it. Everyone's used to seeing somebody in the room and sort of having that interaction. And but so things that have changed. So the book is put together in four parts, and you've described to some degree sort of the through line of the book, and so you have how you've put things in order here. I've got a few things here that I'd love to hear you read, but what do you have something queued up to read?
Sure. I would, I'll go ahead and read this poem called A Driftless Sun, which really does kind of take on some of the things that we were talking about, thinking about it kind of a past that one is sort of giving up. A Driftless Sun. It came to me to sell the family farm, shift its failures to a man who planned to occupy the place for recreation, to hunt the deer that spook and shadow in the pines, my job to consign to another my granddad's stunted grove of walnuts planted against the forester's advice with his hired man Tiny, who died by stepping in front of a train, though first he roped his dog Bear to a nearby tree, tacking on a note that read, "Take care off me." Does anyone remember this fat fact? A loaf of toast and a dozen eggs was Tiny's daily breakfast meal. Give it to me. I'll remember that bit too. I fished that muddy pond just once. Its manure slurry slipped downstream from the Tullius brothers' hogs. Shot the $1 trophied on my wall, whose crippled hoof had slowed him dangerously down. In town again, I pulled the locks off all the doors of the barn. Empty now, October now, the deer not yet come to any harm.
So I take it that of course was about a piece of family property, and um, other than the obvious of what we just heard, but sort of talk about what that experience was like for you to really sort of go through that.
Sure. So you know, this was a farm. It had belonged to my grandfather, and after his death, we held on to it. You know, we leased out the cropland for many years, but we kept it. And you know, my family hunted on it, and it just, you know, we retained that as a kind of there's a sort of smaller farm property that I grew up on, and then this was the sort of bigger farm that had belonged to my grandfather. So, um, you know, there was a lot of sentiment attached to that place and a lot of history. But this is a town that, you know, my family were one of the first families who settled in this part of Wisconsin, and you know, in the 1840s and 50s, when people
Where did they
when
go?
they came from Germany. They emigrated from Germany, and the town itself was mostly was settled by German and Swiss immigrants who moved to this part of Wisconsin. And so, there are generations of my family who have lived in this town, and I'm was the sort of last of the line. And so selling the farm, when it was really determined that, no one was going to live there, that I wasn't going to live there, nor was my brother. And so it really needed to go. And it became my job to do it. And it felt like, I mean, on the one hand, it also felt like finally liberating to give it up, to sort of, do that. But it's also, you feel like a failure, in some ways, like you're the end of the line. You're the one who couldn't hold on to the place and had to, decided to let it go. The thing about it, of course, and about this part of the country is that it's in a very beautiful little part of Wisconsin. And but farming in that area has changed so much in the recent decades. And now the land is mostly valuable as hunting properties. And so people from Chicago and Milwaukee buy these as hunting properties, and that's what they're for. They're for recreation. And so, it felt like that also happened in 2018. It felt like that it was a year for me to kind of be saying goodbye to a lot of things, and this was certainly one of them.
Yeah, and so you mentioned, of course, the idea that you would not have any heirs that would take the property, and so maybe if you could go to The Son I'll Never Have, it seems to be related.
Sure, I'll read that one. The son I'll never have. The son I'll never have is crossing the lawn. He is lying on an imaginary bed, the coverlet pulled up over his knees I don't dare describe. I recoil from imagining him as meat and bone, as a mind and hands stroking the fur of his pet rabbit. I never gave him the accordion I used to play, my mother and I, in duets, the Minnesota polka, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Never watched him push noodles into his mouth with fingers while I wished he would use the spoon, shiny with disuse. I am free from longing to be free. I do as I please. My money is my own. All the mistakes I make are only my mistakes. What is it to look at something you made and see the future? What is it to have someone made by your body, but whose mind remains just out of reach? I'll never know. Come here, little rabbit. Eat these greens. I will pet your cloudy fur with the mind's hand.
Well, there you go. So how long have you been thinking about not having an heir?
I think it became very I never wanted children. That idea has never occurred to me. I'm not someone who, I didn't have that particular narcissistic urge. I mean, I've had others, but not that one. And so, I never really wanted that. But I think it was after the death of my nephew that, who was my brother's only child. When I did kind of realize that, there wasn't any family legacy. There wasn't any, anymore. I was the end of a line. And you know what? That's fine in some ways, like to be the end of a family line. It's like, I mean, we're not that special, you know what I mean? Like we really just, weren't that remarkable a group of people. It's actually fine that we're kind of not leaving, our genetic material behind. On the other hand, I think that a lot of this was kind of thinking about the tragedy of his death, and thinking about that loss, thinking about the loss of someone who I loved and cared about, and the kind of pain that really caused the family and how kind of traumatic it was. And and of course there was his suffering as well. He committed suicide. So
How old was your nephew? How old was your nephew when he passed away?
he was 21. So he was, you know, a young man just kind of on the brink of his, of kind of figuring out his potential, but he was manic depressive, and he, you know, quite impulsively committed suicide.
Yeah, just tragic. Well, there's an amazing poem that you have in the book called "Elegy for a Hanged Boy." It would be great to hear that.
Sure. Elegy for a Hanged Boy. Your white body drifts outside the frame, somewhere beyond the reaches of concern. You died in Portland with a noose around your neck, alone. When you were an infant, I held you on my chest, gripped your arm when you were a little older. Later still, I watched you eat the dinner I cooked from food that grew and ripened one summer in the yard. Your smoke particles now sunstruck and Pacific. This morning, I turn you out, push against the clouded thought you have become. But you come back when I turn my face into the pillow, exiled though you are to the wind's country, stirring the upper orders of the air. I know now that ghosts indeed exist, but they are not what you expect. They are nothing but a mood you cannot shake, the dust that dulls the edges of the mirror to darken the bruise of the day.
Must have been an amazing experience for your family. How were your? So was this your brother's child?
It was.
Yeah. And how is the family doing?
You know, I think there's always going to be you know, a wound there. I think that you know, one of the terrible things about, you know, about losing someone like that, especially, is, you know, for the longest time you would find yourself in a state of mourning, you know, in a state in a period where you're just kind of um, still shocked and still, you know, really still missing them. And at time passes, and then one day you realize that it's been hours since you thought about them, and then a week comes where you realize it's been days since you thought about them, and then, you know, suddenly more time goes by and they begin to recede. And that is also terrible, because you also begin to understand that part of the process of, after going through an intense period of grieving, you begin to, the person begins to grow more and more distant. You don't feel them as acutely as you once did. And so that loss, which once somehow held them closer, also begins to heal. And so, you know, the person is they it's not that they fade away exactly, you still have your memory of them, but they stop becoming quite as potent. That's what the, you know, I mean, we all will go through this in our lives, we will all experience that. You know, you think of Queen Victoria remaining in black in mourning for the entirety, for the rest of her life, because she didn't want to give up that memory. She wanted that daily reminder. But we don't have that quite, right? There's always this sense of someone receding a little bit. And that's also terrible in its own ways, but it also makes life bearable. You know, I think the family, we're always going to miss him and think about him, um, but you know, I mean, time continues to pass, and you know, and one does, you know, you live with it and you move on.
Yeah. And of course, you have the, as many people do, you have the opportunity to continue to celebrate the life, even though it was cut short. But there are many ways in which that can happen, and so I think it's a beautiful way of exploring that we all have to do, particularly when somebody's life was ended so short. And so,
Mhm.
let's move on to another poem. I want to know about the Museum of Bees.
So it's so funny. I don't, you know what? I don't think I've ever read this. I haven't read this poem a whole lot. So I made a little pilgrimage when I had a fellowship in Italy at a place called Civitella Ranieri Foundation, and it's a magnificent place in Umbria, and I was there for 6 weeks. But when I was in Italy, I really, really wanted to go see. I've had an obsession ever since he was uncovered with this figure of Ötzi the Iceman, and um, he was a figure, a person from the Bronze Age, essentially, whose body was found in a thawing glacier up on an Alp. And when hikers found him, they didn't understand that he was thousands of years old. They thought it had been someone who had fallen and frozen and died. It wasn't until they found, that he was wearing a bear fur hat, for instance, that they figured out that he was, you know, ancient. So there's a museum in Bolzano, Italy, way in the north in the Alps. And I made a kind of pilgrimage to go to that museum and to go see him. There's a poem in the book about him, but one day I was up in that beautiful region, that beautiful part of Italy up in the Alps, and I was hiking around and I saw a little sign for a place called the Museum of Bees. And that's what it was. And I thought, it was like, shouldn't it be the Museum of Beekeeping or something? But it was like Museum of Bees. And I was like, oh no, they've all died. And now we have to have a museum for them. But in some ways, that's kind of what I was thinking about when I saw this idea. And it was in this ancient farmhouse in the Alps, and it was really beautiful, but there was also something a little chilling about it. So I'll go ahead and read that poem, The Museum of Bees. At the Museum of Bees, there are no bees, just the empty boxes of the hives, painted gaily, offered as folk art, and displayed here in this ancient farmhouse, picturesque on the slope of an alpine meadow with its thatched roof and its valuable view, its fallow fields mowed periodically to keep the best alpine flowers in bloom. The bee boxes smell of warm wax, a whiff of honey with its faint trace of chamomile. And in the part of the museum that shows how the farmers once lived, there is a glass case containing a doll with a porcelain head, its marble eyes black and unblinking, staring upward at a heaven fixed in its unseeing gaze. I assume this is the Christ child reproduced for domestic veneration, and I admire its human hair, which is tow-colored and curled in spiral locks that fall around its matte china gray face. Someone sewed a swaddling gown from strips of silk and lace. On a bed of brocade, the little body lies, sealed in its coffin of glass. Outside, on the sun-cast meadow, hikers traverse the trail on their way past this forgotten house, hidden in a cluster of trees, the bees, too, having been forgotten or left to make their own way wild in the domesticated woods and far from the diligent hands of men.
Lovely. And of course, I love how it actually came about. It's such a great story to understand how you came across that Museum of Bees. Well, let's talk a little bit about the writing seminars at Bennington, and you'll be going. Well, this whole last year, I take it was all virtual.
So I now direct the graduate writing program at Bennington. It's a low residency MFA program, which means our students are only on campus typically twice a year for 2 10-day intensives. And it was, in many ways, we were really fortunate. I was directing a distance learning program, and we'd been doing this for 26 years. What we really needed to figure out was what to do with those 2 10-day residencies, and we made them all virtual. I think that, rather than having to kind of create a whole new structure for a semester, for a whole new way of teaching, we didn't really have to do that, as our students are already engaged in a kind of deep correspondence with their teachers. But we did have to rethink how we managed those 2 periods of residency, which we did. And so again, in June, it's coming up pretty soon, we'll have another residency, but we do plan to be back in person in January. That's our great hope. So that's what we're planning for and what we're looking forward to.
That's great. It's nice to hear that you'll be able to do those in-person residencies as soon as January. I mean, crossed.
That's the hope.
How many students do you have in the program?
So there's currently about 120 students enrolled in the program, and then we have always a graduating class. This time it's about 25. The residents, then we have, I think, 27 faculty. There's a staff of 4. There are volunteers. So the residency itself ends up being a cast of about 200. And we're pretty much busy starting at 8 in the morning, going till 11 or midnight every night. So it's a really full time.
And you raised, it's why I wanted to ask the question about it, because I have been thinking that there has been, I mean, going back to Warren Wilson, there have been, particularly on the writing side, on the MFA writing side, there have been a lot of low residency programs out there, and they have really been very successful. You and I both know many good writers and poets who have gone through those programs and have been very good. And do you think there's something that those of you who have taught in and directed low residency programs can teach those who are in the high residency programs, and particularly as they have to deal with COVID? Have there been lessons that have been transferable?
Well, maybe one should probably ask the kind of high residency programs, certainly, but I think one of the things that we really rely on is this model of correspondence.
Yeah.
I think certainly in education everywhere, and certainly in higher ed, everyone just rushed. I remember it was this meeting in like late February or early March, maybe the first week of March, being called into a mandatory meeting on campus with IT, where they said, all right, we're gonna bring your laptop, we're gonna show you this new thing that we're gonna do. It's called Zoom, and we're gonna do it. And we were all like, huh? So we sat down, and that's how long ago it was. Now it's just ubiquitous. But
Right.
if you'll remember, there was a time when we, were like, I don't know, I've never heard of that. Like, it was this thing. And now suddenly everyone around the world is doing this and is using this. That kind of a technological transformation has been really remarkable. But with it, we also just kind of decided that video conferencing was a kind of one-for-one deal, especially in terms of education, that you could replicate a classroom on your screen and you could teach that way. Well, teachers know that there are a lot of things that happen in a classroom that can't happen on a screen, and the ways in which people can recede, the ways people can kind of fade away and not engage or not feel engaged. All of those are kind of challenges. I think a low residency program, what we have is a kind of model of this sort of deep consideration and correspondence, where the writer prepares assignments, a packet of work, which they then send to their teacher, who then has a period of time to respond to it in depth by writing to them. And I think that's another model. It's a kind of older one, if you'll remember old correspondence courses that sort of people took. But it does that. I think it's well suited to writing, particularly. I think that it really does kind of reinforce this idea of, move us away from the notion of the immediate response, of the rapid fire email, of the kind of rapid cycling that we do, looking at our phones, checking the email, getting a notification of something. It actually slows that down a little bit and creates a model in which we can really concentrate, we can think, we can respond with depth and consideration, we can change what we think and shape it over a period of time, and then send it to someone for their, feedback and for their consideration. And I think that that is another thing that we should also consider. I think being able to do both, being able to see people's faces, being able to talk to them in real time is vital. I wouldn't want to give that up. But I also think there are things that one can borrow from those models that might be germane to the ways in which we teach in the future. I think if we believe we're going to go back 100% to the way things were before we all started doing this, before the pandemic, we'd be making a terrible mistake. I think we've learned a lot about what needs to happen in person and what can, think of all the business meetings, all of the, flying around, all of the fuel, all of the, to show up in a room and be there for 3 hours only to get on a plane and fly back across the country. Those kind of things don't need to happen anymore. And in education, I think we've figured out we're really asking questions about, what is access? Who is, what is a student in our program? Who gets access to our college, to our university, to our program? Can we have students who don't have to be there? Who are we excluding? Who are we including? What new doors has this opened? I think that it's been, college administrators have never worked harder than they did this last year. I mean, really, to try and keep things afloat, to try and keep people engaged, to not lose students, to not have students lose themselves. People worked really, really hard to kind of keep it all going. I think parents are desperate to have students back in classrooms. I know 18-year-olds, we've really figured out they want to go to college. They want to live on a campus. They want to be with, make new friends. They want those kind of relationships to be formed and to have that model of education. We do know that. But I also think we need to think about what we learned and the kind of new skills and the new technology that we have as we think about what really needs to happen and what doesn't.
Yeah. And again, I think you kind of answered the question for the high-res programs out there, that there really is a lot. And I think particularly the whole idea about being slightly more intentional or allowing more deliberation, that sometimes when somebody's caught up in a bit of a rat race of teaching, a live in-person classes, particularly if they have like 3 or 4 that they're doing, it's they don't always have the time for being deliberative about it. And I think that that's a great model that you're speaking about. One last question. Well, actually, we're out of time, but just one last quick question. I want to say congratulations. You're going to be the new writing, the chair of the writing committee of the Fine Arts Work Center. And of course, you and I both know somebody very well, a late chair, Roger Skillings, of course, who really, we both worked with him a tremendous amount and loved him dearly. So, that's a big job you're taking on there. I mean, you and I were around, when Stanley was alive and Alan Dugan and, a lot of these people who really put that together. Do you have any sense of what your role is going to be with regard to the writing committee at the Fine Arts Work Center?
Well, I think there's a big kind of changeover that's happening at the work center. It's a kind of generational change that's happening. Really, I think since Roger has died, that's maybe the last of those who were around at the founding of the Fine Arts Work Center. That whole generation is now gone. I think that I really want to kind of give back to an organization that really gave me so much, that, of some of my just best memories happened there at the Fine Arts Work Center. Some of my closest friends I've made, who are dear to me still to this day, are with me. People who I met there. I really care about the place. And while I have to say, I was initially reluctant to sort of take it on. I think that you don't want the person who's eager to take that job on. It's good to have the person who's like, I don't know, that's a lot. But it's an organization that's very dear to me, and I want to make sure that it has a long and healthy future. And I want to do whatever I can to support it and to make sure that it does continue. And so it continues to thrive. And, as someone who did know some of those founding people, I hope to kind of keep some of that alive, pass some of that on to a new generation of writers who are going to be through there. And I guess I will say it's going to be an honor to serve, Hunter, as we'll see. I hope it works out that way.
Well, I'm sure you're going to do a terrific job. When I heard that you were selected, I just thought it was really great. And of course, I have fond memories of our time working there to get together and everything that we did. And so thank you so much for your time this evening. And the book, of course, is God of Nothingness. You can get this at your local independent bookstore. And best of luck with this, and best of luck with your upcoming semester, which I guess will probably start when, in August?
No, well, they actually know our semester starts in June
Yeah.
with when the residency begins, so it's pretty soon.
Right. Well, good luck with that. If you come to South Florida, please come. I'd like to show you 28,000 LGBTQ books. You would find a lot of interesting things there, and you would enjoy that.
I would
And
love.
yeah, and for all of those of you listening, you can see this and share it with your friends. It will be on the Stonewall website as well as on Facebook. And so, hello to all of our friends on Facebook out there. And Ema, if you just want to say hi here one last time, thank you very much for all your work behind the scenes. Thank you. Ema will be leaving us soon as well too. So thank you again. And everyone have a great night, and we'll see you all next week. So long.